Today's modern working professionals expect a learning experience that reflects the world we live in. Canvas LMS is built to help organizations unlock the potential of skill-based learning by focusing on what matters to learners and their educators. From dynamic course delivery to adaptable credentialing, Canvas empowers learners to thrive in a rapidly evolving landscape. See what it's all about at canvas.com.
Welcome to The Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer Podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Melissa Loble. Melissa is the Chief Academic Officer for Canvas by Instructure. She is a professor at UC Irvine. She holds so many advisory roles. We're so excited to talk to you today. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Alexandria. It's lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And as someone who is doing a little mix of like an admin role, but also still teaching, you have a background in teaching. I'm so excited to talk to you about lifelong learning today. I think this is an interesting topic that sometimes folks think that they're better at this than they really are. So we'll explore that topic shortly. But first, let us talk a little bit about your origin story. So how did you land in your current role and what was accidental in your journey?
I love this question, largely because so much about my journey has been accidental, but very exciting and inspiring. So I am the product of parents that were technology parents as well as teachers, but never necessarily thought I would end up in some sort of teaching or training capacity. And then found myself after doing some graduate education into the educational technology world. So I've spent times on the institution side where I've led educational technology projects. I've found myself on the vendor side like I am now, where I've helped lead strategy and academic approaches in organizations. And then I'm on my 27th year of teaching online, which is wild. And so all of it has been really about being passionate about teaching and learning and training and development, and then finding throughout my journey opportunities to be able to leverage that. But never was any of this planned in the way it's laid out. And I think being accidental is the best way to be sometimes, because you can find opportunities and grow and develop yourself in ways that you never expected or planned for that are so valuable to how you're contributing broader to your community.
Wow. All I could think about was wanting to follow up and ask you about 27 years of teaching online. I mean, talk about lifelong learning. First of all, so many people had to teach themselves how to do that when the pandemic hit in 2020. But I'm sure that you have a very interesting story having to constantly reteach yourself what that looks like. Because 27 years ago, we didn't have the platforms that we have now.
No, it's been an interesting evolution to watch technology evolve and how you could piece together simple things like AOL chat spaces way early on in my journey, and then watch the technologies evolve and then ground yourself in what's good pedagogy, what's good practice, but how do I now take advantage of the technologies that have surfaced so I can deliver even better practice. To this day, I say instructional design or e-learning design is an art more than it is a science. And you develop your inner artist as you do it over the years. And then you use things like technology as your paint and your paintbrushes to build something beautiful. And they only help over that period of time. But it's been an interesting artistic journey for me too, from a design perspective.
Yeah, in some ways, folks have it easier than ever. Maybe someone would argue the opposite, because technology is so much easier to use in some ways. So you don't have to wear as many hats or have as many skill sets, and sort of being able to master the technology piece while also trying to follow best practices for learning and doing it in a digital space at the same time. And that is just a lot of juggling to go back and forth.
It really is. I think on one hand, there's so many technologies, so there's so many more things at your disposal you can leverage. And I do think that makes it easier. I think, though, it also makes it harder, because how do you piece all of this together? And how do you make meaning out of it? And then how do you also leverage successfully what your context may only have. So you may be working in an organization where they use a certain authoring tool or a certain set of video tools or things like that. Even though the world is your ocean in a lot of ways, how do you segmentize that in a meaningful way so that you can do it in the environment in which you're designing? I'll also say what's super fascinating to me is, well, technology is easier to use, the bar continues to be lifted. So I teach in a certificate program in instructional design. And in that class, I've had to watch my students have to have higher and higher bars on things like image creation, video creation, the way you're building scenarios and simulations and different kinds of learning experiences, that because the technology is out there, people are expecting more out of the technology, and you're having to develop your skills continuously so that you can deliver that to that higher expectation.
Oh, that's a good way to phrase it. Yeah. Okay. This is all tying into our kind of broader topic about lifelong learning. We're just kind of talking about something specific within that broader spectrum, right? So maybe a good place to start is just sort of why this topic, why it's important to you, to your organization. I'll tell you a little bit about what some of the L&D practitioners who have taken the ATD capability model say, which I'm sure you can guess, or I can just say right now is just that it's important, and they rate it as an important as folks have taken this assessment over the years since it rolled out in 2020. And it's maybe over 35,000 folks who have taken it at this point. They continue to rank it as one of the capabilities that is the most important in an organization. Though I have some thoughts about whether or not L&D professionals are really any good at it, and whether the people in their organization are any good at lifelong learning. And maybe that's kind of like cynical or pessimistic, but I'll go back to you first, and you tell me, what do you think about this topic? Why? Why is it important? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So there's some really great research out there that's talking about how we're going to live longer lives. It's through the Stanford Center on Longevity is where some of this research being done. And this idea of humans, thanks to modern medicine and modern environments that we all live in, are going to live 100-year lives. Not only are they researching that piece of it, but there's a fair amount of research like the World Health Organization and other large global organizations are talking about we're going to hold up to 10 careers over our lifespan. No longer are we, maybe you have the 1 to 3 jobs and then you retire because you stay at places for a long time and you develop. You may stay at the same organization, but you may have completely different roles. This has been my case in the last 10 and a half years at Instructure as an example. So we're going to have these longer lives and we're going to have more jobs. What's so important is being self-aware of yourself as a learner and being able to understand how to map your own development so you can be successful in those roles, not only for those roles and those organizations, but for your own health and well-being and personal development. And so this is why I'm particularly passionate about lifelong learning. I'll say it, I've reinvented myself multiple times in my career for these kind of accidental opportunities that have been so powerful, but without knowing myself as a learner and engaging in active opportunities to develop myself, either formally through my organizations or informally on my own, I would have never been able to be successful in those roles or contribute back to those organizations in the way in which, derived most meaning for who they serve.
It's so interesting because I think first of all, people living to 100 years old, I mean, I think it's on the horizon or it's coming, and just thinking that there's this book called Successful Aging, and I'm completely blanking on who wrote it, a cognitive neuroscience. Are you familiar with it? It's Daniel someone. I'm blanking on his last name.
Can't think of his last name, but yes, I'm familiar with the work, and it's super interesting work. There's so much more we understand cognitively about how we learn today than we did 10 years ago. And it's really interesting to start to layer that into 100-year lives or 90-year lives or whatever it might be. But yes, that work is really interesting.
Okay, I found it. Successful Aging by Daniel Levitin. He is a cognitive neuroscientist. He has done really interesting work, even with like the importance of music or how we process music or what's happening in our brains. That book on successful aging is really interesting just because continuing to learn, continuing to do tasks and activities is actually something that can help you to live longer when you're kind of creating that difficulty or that type of activity and purpose in your life. So they sort of like go hand in hand, not just like, hey, you're going to be living like for a while, so you might as well pick up some new thing to learn. But the people who are always doing the work of putting themselves in what I always think is an uncomfortable zone, like you're getting out of your comfort zone, making yourself uncomfortable, that creating those desirable difficulties that you're also going to happen to live longer.
Oh yeah, I love that. My husband and I talk about this all the time, where during the pandemic, I took up a hobby, scuba diving, because it was fairly safe during the pandemic. And he's been a long time instructor. And some of it's really, really hard. And we just had this conversation the other day about you have to be able to do hard things at times in your lives, because it helps. There's so much more from a brain stimulation perspective. And those hard things, even though it seems very isolated to, in my case, okay, it's scuba diving, but it's really hard. Some of the stuff that I'm doing, I can immediately see the impact on my profession as well, and how I look or approach a situation or problem solve something, or how comfortable I am in those situations. To your point, this being engaged and getting out of your comfort zone or doing hard things at appropriate times, it evolves you as a human, and you end up having so much more to contribute because you're evolving in your both professional and personal contexts.
So let's jump into barriers. I want to talk about common barriers, because to me, when I immediately thought of this topic, I thought about how a lot of folks claim to be lifelong learners, or they claim their organization or culture has lifelong learning, and a lot of times don't know the scientific learning principles. Like they don't have that background. So they're not using effective strategies. There's all sorts of barriers, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on what makes this difficult? And it just almost another reason to say, why talk about this? Because some folks might say, yeah, we already have that covered. Like we love that in our organization and we're doing it and it's easy.
I think that's such an important question. As organizations want to become learning organizations, it's how they do it becomes really, really important. And I think still a lot of organizations are just doing it, as opposed to really being thoughtful about how they do it. It's a really valuable question. I think there's two really big barriers, and then a whole host of others as well. But I think first is time, prioritizing it. So if you're going to be a learning organization and you want to create lifelong learners and you want to retool your employees, you have to build time, and you need to build that time in that's becomes motivational for employees to want to be engaged, right? So one of the things I always think about is there's two forms of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. The organization is required to create extrinsic motivation. You can't just count on the intrinsic that's within a person to want to continue to develop them if you are going to become a lifelong learning organization. That takes time. You have to give people time to do it. You have to have time to build it. Sometimes you give employees all the time in the world, but you don't actually craft the most meaningful, reskilling or retooling or learning opportunities. And you have to have time to then go evaluate and reflect on it. So just because I took that course in time management, for example, now I need to have moments after where I can think about, what did I learn as I've retooled myself, and how am I reflecting on what I learned and how I feed that back in? So I think one of the big barriers is time. Similarly, I think a second big barrier is developing the practice in all content creators. So anybody, I'm actually going to say learning experience designers. Anybody out there building learning experience designers, many of you listening to this are instructional designers, have been doing this for a long time, are outstanding experts in this, but trying to go find that skill set everywhere so that as you as a learner can go engage in really meaningful content, it's a little bit harder. We're still a specialized skill set as instructional designers. And there's things to know about how we already talked about. How's the brain work? What are the most effective ways to put a learner at the center? How do you deeply engage a learner? How do you use modern technologies? There's so much embedded in that the average person who may be responsible for some of this content creation or learning experience design doesn't have that background. So there's a lot of not really great stuff. So if we don't have a lot of time, and then we can't find good stuff in the areas where we need to retool ourselves, we become very unmotivated or, and unexcited about being a lifelong learner. And then we just don't do it.
Okay. I love that you mentioned this really nuanced way of thinking about time, because that is one of the biggest barriers that folks who have taken the capability model assessment or that report into some pulse surveys and things that we have some ATD data say, and one that kind of verbatim quote that I pulled out is having to carve out time versus having time. So that they used to have more time in their careers and in their roles, and now they have to really try to protect it and find a way to do it as an individual, which you were talking about some of the responsibility of organizations and what they have to do, creating extrinsic motivation. I love that part of it should be having the onus of creating, carving out time, not just relying on individuals or the managers. But then I want to build off of that, because something that you talked about, not all time is created equal, and some of that time is going to happen in different places. So even just like the time when you're evaluating and reflecting, the time when you're practicing, building the skills, the time when you're doing the feedback, when you're doing the practicing, that's like, I don't know. My heart sings because I'm like, this is great. This is evidence-based methods. This is how we're going to build skills and build them to mastery. But you need to have someone who is at the high level be able to understand that, to know you're still building those skills when you're removed a few months away and a few months out and you're coming back to it. You're creating all this intentional, purposeful time, and they have these different purposes. So absolutely love that.
I love that evidence-based, that connection, because that makes my heart sing too. Organizations think, okay, we're going to set aside some instructional designers. They're going to build these courses. These are the topic areas. So they go and they have the amount of time that it takes to build those courses. And that's all they give, right? And then they give the amount of time. Okay, these courses on average are going to take 20 minutes, and we're going to have people do 4 of those over the course of 3 months. So now we need to give people that 80 minutes. Somehow they're going to have, and we're going to carve this time out. You're going to do every other Friday from 2 to 5 is a meetingless Friday. And then that's when you're going to go do this work. Well, that is only a small piece of it. On the design and the course building, you should be spending as much time evaluating, assessing the course itself and the delivery and how well it ensured the growth of those skills. You should be evaluating the context in which that lives. And that should take as much time as building the course, and constantly updating that course based on changing in the organization. So that's already time that people aren't carving out. And then to your point, the time that we spend for ourselves, we have to be not just learning that thing, but practicing that, reflecting on that practice, going back and creating this continuous development cycle for ourselves. So again, the 2 to 5 on Fridays for no meetings doesn't cut it, because it's not building in this cycle of development for yourself that becomes the most impactful. And that's where you have to, it's not just on the company for that extrinsic motivation, it becomes intrinsic as well. You have to say, I'm going to prioritize reflecting on this over this, or I'm going to give myself 5 minutes between meetings at least twice a day, where all I do is jot notes down for myself on where were my skills going into that, where are my skills coming out of that, and where do I need to continue to develop. You have to build this cycle both on the organization side and on the human, the learner side, so that you're really building the long-term pathways in your brain, and that those skills become skills you can truly hone and use.
So as we've kind of already talked about here, I think one of the biggest challenges is you can be an amazing instructional designer and you know all of the evidence-based methods, but part of your challenge is that you're doing it for other learners in your organization. You're trying to create these self-directed learning opportunities, and that person doesn't know much. They have not been explicitly taught, and they haven't figured it out intuitively. And that's okay. That's normal. A lot of people have these intuitive methods that they rely on that we know are ineffective, and they just don't know, haven't been told yet. So do you have recommendations, methods of how to support these learners in their process of kind of consuming or retaining content, especially when it's in an informal way? Or let me give examples of a lot of our audience. They serve frontline or deskless workers. They have folks who are going to be remote and hybrid, or they're global. So it's all sorts of different people that you're serving and trying to help package these principles. What are your your recommendations for that?
Yeah. Oh, that's such an important question. So the first recommendation that I have as we're thinking about how to really support these learners is to know your learners. I know this sounds crazy because for a lot of people, it's well, of course I know who these are people in my organization. We're all trying to do this thing. And it's like, you really have to understand audience definition to build the right kind of learning experiences. So things like, what are their tech skills coming in? What are their attitudes towards technology? What are their attitudes towards learning? Simple things like devices, and we all do that, but then more complicated things like, what are their expectations of them and their jobs? And where does this sit in those expectations? I believe you have to sit down before you start storyboarding or building out any sort of learning experience, whether it's a short 5-minute thing or a big multi-day, huge training event or anything in between. You have to sit down and make the effort to write out who your audience is and across all dimensions. There's some good resources. I can share one if you want to share it with your audience around just audience definition and what should go into that. But you've got to know and don't make assumptions. It's so easy as instructional designers in your organization to make assumptions about your colleagues. But what you're really doing is making assumptions about the most immediate people you touch, not about the people in those departments that you may be serving. So that's one of the big ones. The other one I'll mention, sort of how to manage this is giving people example roadmaps for skill development. Even though, again, as instructional designers, and they always say teachers, we're students, but we know what those paths look like. Our employees or the people we serve don't. So how do you show them, okay, you're going to take this course, but in the context of that coming into it, you'll have done this, and here's a collection of calendar items or a toolkit for you. So now what you've done is you've taken this course. Now you're going to go the following week, take 10 minutes of reflection. You have a calendar item and it's got a question prompt. And then you're going to 2 weeks later, go have a conversation with one other colleague. And here's that. So you can book that for yourself. Then you're going to come back and take this next stage or an ancillary piece of learning. Like give them a roadmap so that employees don't have to teach themselves. They have examples of how to do this. And then as they practice and do this, they'll figure out which parts work for them, which parts don't. But it gets them in this habit of learning isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing experience. And it has threads among each of the stops in that experience.
I love it. Especially, I feel like I start to load with all of the things that I think are really hard. So, when you're trying to create these like communities of practice that's informal and rely on the job training and learning from your peers and your team, and you want to support folks to do that without having to create a formal training program, because that's going to be better, but that also can be more difficult and it has to be so intentional. So I love all these little examples and ideas of things that you can show them and they have access to somewhere so that then they're like, oh yeah, I can riff off of that or do something. Or even just when you're gaining someone on your team and you don't have to go to L&D or HR because you've already done that before. You have some examples and you're like, oh, we know how to create this shadowing opportunity, or we're going to do this thing and we're going to check in afterwards. And then we're going to check in again a little later and see what they remember from that thing that we were just doing together and when they're going to be ready to do it on their own. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. We also don't spend enough helping other people understand the why behind feedback. So a great example, this was an aha moment I had last week. I have somebody that works on my team, and I have a small team, but especially if you're a manager of people, you're collaborating. We were writing a paper together and we were collaborating on this. And it was so easy for me to just jump in and go and make edits to it because we're joint writing. So I make these edits to it. And then I get on a one-on-one conversation with this employee after. We were talking through it and I'm like, oh, I should probably explain to you why I made those edits. She's like, I would love that, because what I do is I go into your history and I'm trying to figure out why you're editing things. These weren't just like grammatical errors, these or edits. These were more like, what are we saying and why are we saying it? She's like, I go through the history. So that's helpful for me. And I was like, wow, good for you for actually going through the history. I probably would have looked at it and been like, all right, well, this is what she wanted. So I'm going to move on. And then I thought, oh, if only I had made a couple of comments. So I would go change something and then I left a comment on, here's why I changed it, or this is what I'm trying to do, or I'm using this reference. That's a writing example, but think about doing that to create really informal learning opportunities as a leader or a manager, like giving people the why you've given them feedback and not necessarily the formal feedback in the context of doing something. just expose a little bit more of your why. And then that helps that person start to apply that why. It also becomes a reflection moment for you and your own development.
Yes, I love that example. I know because I've done that myself, and it can be so much easier to not give the why, do the edit and be like, I made these really quick changes. Here they are. But it takes an extra step for you, especially if it's like not even a decision that you really have to think about anymore. So as you're writing the feedback, you're having to say, why did I change that? And sometimes I have to be honest and say, this is a personal preference of mine, that this is just a me thing. And then something else is like, there's a more legitimate reason why I made this edit. And that's this reason here as well.
That's such a good example as well of understanding who you are, because that's a reflection moment too, apart from the skills that you may have, and where and how are you applying both.
This is sort of a specific, but I was curious if you think there's different strategies for supporting different like seniority levels of learners in your organization. So sometimes I see some feedback from our L&D community, especially in webinars. They're like, yeah, this is great, but this is not going to work with our senior leaders, and they're the ones who need it most. So curious if you have any thoughts of like, does your strategy change for helping some of those senior leaders become these more self-directed, lifelong, continuous learning folks versus, someone else who's earlier and more eager in their career?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. What's interesting about more senior leaders is typically they're farther along in their career. In most cases, some cases there are some very senior people in organizations, of very young organizations. But so assuming they're a little bit farther in their career, they've probably not gotten a lot of feedback, which makes me really sad to this day. But feedback still is one of the top ranked things that employees ask for and don't get. Mm-hmm. So they probably haven't gotten a lot of feedback. So they don't know how to manage that feedback. They're probably not aware of themselves as learners unless they are in like a true L&D professional that's been, this is who's ingrained in them. So I look around at our fellow executives at my company, and like, they're not taught how to be learners. They've had to figure that out themselves over the years. So knowing that about your audience, how you build your learning experience does matter. I do believe you have to do it differently. And some of the things you have to do is you have to be really careful with some basic content, because they're going to understand the beginning of things and they're going to check out. Then they're done, right? They're like, I already know this. When 2 or 3 minutes in, it might be something they don't know at all. So a great example, a lot of us do security and compliance training at organizations. I think everybody does that. Starting with some basic definitions, that can work for, a less experienced audience. Don't start there with your executive audience. They already know that. You have to have a grabber. You have to have a lead in to learning experiences that immediately connect for them. One, I'm going to learn something here. And two, I'm going to be able to immediately apply it. So this is where my second strategy is. So knowing that it is different and knowing that you need to start with something that they need to learn. A lot of scenario or story-based learning really helps, because they then can immediately translate, or even if you've got stories or scenarios that you've all experienced as an organization, starting in those places, grabbing their attention, then circling back to maybe some of the simpler stuff to make sure they learn that, and then progressing as you level through content, progressing the difficulty also keeps them engaged, because it's all about how do you get them in. Likely they'll process it pretty well, and likely they'll go apply it, because if you've got them in and they're hooked, they're not usually just checking boxes unless it's a compliance thing. They're not usually just checking boxes. At this point, what they're doing is they're actually connecting to the learning and evolving their own thinking. So I do think it has to be different. And I think there's some specific strategies that you can take as you're trying to address executive audiences.
As I was listening, I was like, oh, maybe another strategy is like reducing scaffolding and just like making it as difficult as possible, because maybe that's going to like help with the hook and get them engaged. I remembered my sister giving me this example. She's a teacher. There's like some task that she was doing with like another adult, and they like immediately were like, I don't know how to do this. This is hard. And then she was like, oh yeah, I'm doing exactly what my students do, which is I didn't read it at all. And she wanted them to do it for me. And I wanted a lot of hand holding because it was my first time. And I don't want to have to do all the work of like figuring out and sitting there on my own to do it. So I realized that there's no like one strategy that's going to work, because some people are going to want different things. They're going to want a little bit more support in breaking down the steps. And someone else is going to enjoy the challenge of being like, wow, this is this really hard tackling this thing that I have to tackle. And then it makes them feel good that they've sort of like figured it out on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that where you can build in choice to how you give somebody an opportunity to learn, that starts to feed that too, right? And a more senior level audience is a great place to give them choice as well, because the choice does two things. One, it helps them tailor to where they're at, right? And it gets them to do some of the things that they may not instinctively want to do because they're like, oh, I'm just going to skip past those instructions. But choice also gives them the ability to, again, be at the center of the learning, because the most important thing you can do as you're building this is make sure the learner is taking full ownership of that experience, whether it's regularly, doing interactive activities embedded in the learning, especially if it's asynchronous, or whether it's making choice or like branching scenarios, things like that really come into play. Because while it's important learning strategy and development strategy, it's even more important engagement strategy. And that becomes where you really have to focus. And flashy content isn't the answer necessarily. It's how you build that content for those individuals to keep them engaged is the most important thing.
I wonder if I'm switching gears. In my head, I'm thinking maybe we're moving from like less tangible to more meta, because this is my question. What ideas or recommendations do you have to prepare people where the content doesn't exist yet, or we haven't like defined exactly what it is, that skill is that we want, but we want you to be ready for it?
I love that. You mean all of the future around where AI is going, right? There's so much there that we need skills. I think about this in the case of data and analytics. It's become a table stakes skill that a lot of people need, but we didn't know 10 years ago what that looked like, or cybersecurity 15 years ago. We've got to future-proof the skills. So a couple of things that I think are really useful. Again, in the content that you know, or the learning experiences that you do know, we were talking about reflection earlier. As you build them, teach them how to be a learner in that context. So there's ways that you can prompt in learning experiences in your feedback. For example, let's say they're making a choice. They're doing a scenario and they're making a choice. And then you prompt feedback that is like, that was a great choice. Here's how you could think about using that elsewhere in decision-making in your organization, or how you would apply that. Like, bake in awareness so that they're ready to teach themselves. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think there's a real role for development of employees around inquiry. You can have learning experiences that don't actually have the answers, but they're about understanding the questions that we're all asking about a particular topic. Because if you get that and you get them hooked, you get them engaged in what those questions are, as the news, or there's articles, or they go subscribe to something, they can connect, oh, this is why I care about this. I don't know the answer yet. I think generative AI is a really good example in learning. There's a lot we're starting to understand. There's a lot we don't know yet. But because we're out there asking questions, we're just posing the questions. We're giving people learning experiences where those questions are surfacing. Now, when they read an article, or there's, an example that's been shown, they can connect the dots. And then now they're processing and learning without you having to teach them what came 6 months later. So those are a couple of ways that you can think about how to prep for what we don't know. The last one I'll say is, durable skills last a lifetime. So, or whatever you want to call them, durable soft skills. There's never enough development around problem solving, communication skills, working in teams, all of those things that we use every single day and take for granted. There's never too much of that, right? And so how can you, again, maybe use those areas where we don't have the answers yet, but we can hypothesize and have them start to apply those durable or soft skills in that as well.
Those are good recommendations for sure. It kept it broad, just curious how you might respond to that or what you might interpret. You brought up generative AI, which was another question I actually had for you. So I'm going to jump to that. But more specifically, I was just curious what your thoughts are on that and its impact on lifelong learning, or its relationship, how it will complement or compromise, or what are your thoughts and opinions on their relationship with each other?
So there's a couple of areas I'm so excited about generative AI for. One of which, so I just wrapped up my course that I teach. I teach it twice a year. It's 8 weeks long. And I had my students, they were building interactive e-learning experiences, but I had them start to experiment with video, AI generated video, voiceover, music, images. There's some really great stuff out there. And as an instructional designer myself, graphic design has never been my jam. I'm just not particularly good at blank page creation, particularly around imagery and stuff. I never quite got my Photoshop skills up to par, that kind of thing. It is so tangible now. So I think about all the areas, like maybe some people it's writing, maybe some people it's, I've never created music, but think about all that can go into creating a really great learning experience. And AI, if the tools look like this now, I can only imagine what they're going to look like in a year. So this content creation in areas that aren't your specialty, it helps instructional designers, in my mind, and lifelong learners be focused on you and your development and your artist, and not all these tangible technical skills that have been needed for so long. So I'm really excited about generative AI there. And I'm also excited about it from a simulation and a scenario perspective. What generative AI does really well is it can take a body of content and reorganize that body of content. To me, that's been one of the hardest things. I'm a big fan, as you can hear multiple times, I brought scenarios and simulations up. I'm a big fan of that strategy, that application and learning strategy, especially in the workplace. But it's so difficult to build because it's so content heavy, right? Think about every branch you do in a scenario and all of the feedback and the choices and all the paths. And it just like your eyes start to, it just takes so much time. We don't have that time to build that. But that's where generative AI, I think, can really lean in based on a body of content. Where I'm a little maybe worried is everybody thinks the answer is a personal AI bot, and this is going to tell me what I should learn and where I should learn it and how I should learn it. I still think there's a very human rich approach to you charting your own path. And that I worry that those tools will only be as good as the collection of content that they can derive from. And we're going to see an open world of content, but we're also going to see walled gardens all over the place. You know, organizations are going to keep their content in, and even small organizations, that's a small amount of content if you think about it. So I worry about the bot, and the answer to everything is the bot, because I'm just not sure it can come in well enough informed to truly replace what we as humans can do when we're making decisions or choices or learning.
I was using SEMrush the other day, and there's this feature where you can like click on a button and see their recommendations of AI writing changes that they'll do. It's funny because sometimes I didn't like them. I was like, no, I like want to revert back. But there was this little tracker that was showing how often I was using it and counting up the words. And it's like, it gives you a limit. And I didn't test it enough to see, like, is the limit per month? Do you then kind of pay a premium to have unlimited? Is it per piece? Like, I don't exactly know how it works. But it just, as you were describing, that's made me start to wonder if people will try to put parameters on, like, trying to enforce, like, yes, you can use your personalized AI agent to support you, but you sort of have a quota of how much you can time or questions or something you can use. And maybe there's something in there of you also have to like reach out to a peer or a colleague or something that helps to reinforce the community of practice piece. But even as I was like starting to play it out, I'm like, I don't like that. Like, that doesn't sound good. Like, people wouldn't like that. So I'm sure someone will have some creative idea of what's a good way that doesn't feel restricting for you to be able to take advantage of both, that you don't just become this like island silo that only talks to your bot because that's all you need to get things done. Because as you said, the relationship piece, the social piece, being teams, being collaborative is just going to be one of those long-lasting skills that matters in the future, matters now, it always mattered. And that will only continue to matter as we're dealing with more abstract and difficult and volatile and whatever all the words are, things that happen in today's modern workforces, and just the economy moving at the speed of light and tech moving at the speed of light, all of the things.
Maybe this is lofty, but just as you said, I hope humanity becomes the gatekeeper on that, so that it will become eventually evident. I can't just use an AI agent or bot for my entire job, that's not going to get rewarded. I think there'll be times when maybe some of that happens as we figure out AI and we're able to understand where it's being used and not used. But I hope as we evolve over the next 3 to 5 years, it just becomes evident that you need a balance. There's a human balance, and the humanity to it and your ability to use generative AI really well, those two things are what we recognize and reward, as opposed to necessarily the work product itself that might be able to be completely handled. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I think we can get there if we just all, again, become very aware and very present to ourselves in relation to generative AI, in relation to our skills, and in relation to our contribution that we're making into our, professional or even personal worlds.
Okay, hopefully this is a good way to start to wrap up this conversation of lifelong learners for now. Do you have any tips to avoid overwhelm, whether it's as an L&D professional or as just like an individual in your organization, especially as we're talking about, speaking of things like generative AI, which just even thinking about that is causing burnout for some. You have these things that you're needing to keep up with that feel just astronomically fast and could be overwhelming, or maybe it's not. What are your tips to kind of avoid feeling that overwhelm?
I'll start as a lifelong learner. To avoid feeling overwhelmed, we all have our tasks lists or our to-do lists, and we've got our short, medium, and long term. Whenever I have a task, I always identify, okay, to what end? Where can I use that? And a couple of them have been big on my list is like, okay, there's some really interesting generative AI tools out there I want to experiment with. But if I just go block off time to experiment with them, I just become overwhelmed in my own mind of, oh, these are all the places I could use it, but how am I going to use that? And have I looked at the 5 other tools that are doing the same thing? And I just start to swirl. So I will have like to what end for every one of my action items, which maybe that's nerdy and weird. But so like I might have a go write this 3-page paper, to what end? To promote these kinds of ideas or to, initiate this dialogue. So I always have a to what end, because that helps me sort of box a little bit more the activity I'm doing, so that I don't go into it with such an open mind that I become easily overwhelmed because everything's coming at me. So that's one thing that I can recommend doing. The second thing that I recommend doing is always ask others. As I've watched and worked with L&D professionals, they're like, yeah, so in my organization, I'm told I have to use generative AI. So I'm trying to figure out where to use it. You'll hear, hey, I'm going to be, I'm pitching this project, and the customer keeps asking, well, how are you using generative AI? That is so not the right question. What you're using isn't the right question. It's how are you going to drive the outcomes that you're hoping to? So pulling people back to what are the outcomes at the organizational level, I think becomes really, really important. Let's all collectively, if I can have a collective call to action, stop the conversation about what AI are you using, other than if it's a security or privacy issue, and more about what are the outcomes you want and what are the tools you're using to drive those. Because then we can be, again, just like we are individually focused on to what end am I doing something, as an organization, we're using outcomes as our driver or whatever that might be, and quieting the noise of all of the other stuff out there.
I love that, because even I started to think of another question where I was debating whether I should wait till we pause recording to ask you, but you started to answer it for me. So I'll mention it, because I was thinking, do you think that you can consider yourself a lifelong learner if you're not using generative AI at this point? But I feel like you answered it for me by saying even that. What are the outcomes that you're looking for? And then what tools are you using to achieve it? For maybe the folks who are like, I'm waiting for it to be more green friendly and less bias and some more safety protocols, and they're keeping an eye on it, but purposely haven't dipped their toes in yet. And so if you're one of those listeners and you're waiting, that you can still be a lifelong learner and you can still use this strategy.
Absolutely, you can. And I agree. I'm a cautious user of it, just because I think there are things we still don't know, and we need to be thoughtful about our use. There are other people that I deeply respect that work directly with me that are using it everywhere and are just out there experimenting with it all. I'm like, great. I think that's great too. You're all lifelong learners if what you're doing is evolving yourself, and whether that's what tools you're using and you're learning about those, whether that's your practices, your own understanding of teaching and learning, or even your own personal awareness of your strengths, your weaknesses, your blind spots, all of those things. That means in my book, you're a lifelong learner. If you're doing any of that, you are a lifelong learner. Doesn't have to be, the most modern things about everything in your world.
A beautiful way to segue back to you. What are your current learning goals as a lifelong learner?
That is such a great question. So some of my current learning goals related to my profession, I just shifted into this chief academic officer role in January. I mentioned earlier in our conversation, I've been at Instructure for quite a while. And one of my learning goals is to get up to speed on modern teaching and learning practices. It's not that I'm not, but I'm aware of them, but I really want to lean in and how do they align to what do we know about the brain today that we didn't know 5 years ago? That is really particularly interesting to me. Social media has changed it significantly. The way we ingest content all around us has changed it significantly. The evolving nature of the workplace is changing this significantly in how our brains function. We are evolving as a species, and I want to really lean into that space. Now, I know the fundamentals around brain science, but I want to know what's new. And then I want to take that and I want to start talking to people about how do we apply what's new to what our tried and true practices are and what's the middle piece. So that's my professional goal. I mentioned earlier also, I'm a scuba diver, my husband, again, instructor. And on a personal level, we do some of the sort of normal diving that you do. And then I've also become a cave diver. And that it's crazy. Okay, cave diving is crazy. It's wild that I do this. There's days I question myself. The day that we went in to 45 minutes into a hole in the ground and the only way out was 45 minutes back out was a little wild. But in that's the first time in a while I've been super hyper focused in a situation where I was learning. Like I was totally safe. I was with an instructor. My husband's an instructor. I was so safe in what I was doing. It has been a long time where I have not multitasked through a learning experience. And maybe that's shame on me, but I'm trying to piece together personally, why did I get to that place and how can I do that more often? Because I also grew so much faster than I do in sort of my everyday practice. So it's like this full presence, full focus in a contextual situation. So I'm trying to figure that out for myself personally. Like, how do I get there more? How do I get that zone more? Maybe not all the time, but how do I understand that and get out of my own way? Especially having done this, I'm in my 50s. So when you get to that point in your life, there's a lot you've done already, and there's a lot you start to assume How do I get out of that mind frame and use that personal situation to apply to how I just do other personal and professional situations so I can evolve quicker?
I'm like thinking back to that senior leader conversation we had. I'm like, you got to raise the stakes of your learning environment for yourself.
That's right. Let's raise the stakes. I love that you said that. That's such the best way to put that. How do I continue to raise the stakes for myself? And how does that push me and make me completely present to my own learning as a lifelong learner?
Very cool. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing all of your amazing goals. Wow. My face was like starting to sweat when you said you're doing cave diving. That is so scary to me. How can listeners keep up with you and your activity if they want to keep learning from you?
Yeah. I'm probably the easiest to find in LinkedIn. Honestly, that's where I probably post most, especially of my professional activities. It's easy to find me under Melissa Loble. You'll have no problem finding me in LinkedIn. So it's probably the best place. I also do a fair amount of presenting through Instructure and some other places. So I'm at quite a bit of conferences. I'll make sure I'm always posting those in LinkedIn, but keep an eye out for me. And I'd love to meet with listeners before or after a conference, whether it's virtual or in person. So reach out anytime. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think people sometimes think I'm crazy when I do this, but I'd love to do this because the people that are really want to have an interesting conversation will reach out. It's super easy to get a hold of me. It's Melissa, MELISSA @instructure.com. Email me anytime. Let's have a conversation. I always learn from others and would love to learn from you.
I'm misremembering. Don't you host a podcast now?
I do. It's called EduCast 3000. It's part of a collection of podcasts that Instructure does that's called the Instructure Cast. We've got some more specific on our products, which is some of the other podcasts. Ours is we invite professionals from the teaching and learning space, and then we just all get on a conversation and nerd out. So would love to have y'all listen to EduCast 3000. It's part of an Instructure Cast.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. This has been so much fun to talk to you today.
It's been lovely. I love these conversations, and thank you for having me.
Of course. We'll have a great afternoon. Thank you to our sponsor, Canvas by Instructure.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.